believe me. Never had a lot of shit come easy. Had to work hard, struggle. Please tell me that I can't, that I won't, that I'll fail, that I'll never make it out, yeah. Please tell me all the bad and the good, fill my head full of every single doubt, yeah. Please say any negative thoughts, I pump off when I hear people say I cannot. I get off to the young, proving everyone wrong, I won't stop to the top, so you better back off and get lost. I'ma stay loud, stay proud, never running out, never heading south. I'm spreading out, call it what I'm out, can't live it out, I'm getting it down, you never doubt, know what I'm about, I'll get loud, if you're in and out, I keep it sound, go another round.
Today, I am going to introduce to you a module on learning, specifically Theories of Learning 1, in which we shall discuss about classical conditioning. The main objectives of this module are to understand the definition of learning, to understand the process of classical conditioning, and how principles of classical conditioning can be applied to daily life. Our ability to learn seems boundless. We continue to learn new things every day, and we continually use the products of our past learning. Our learning affects how we perceive, remember, think and behave. First, let us understand learning. Learning can be defined as relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of practice or experience. This definition has three important elements. First, learning is a change in behavior for better or worse. Second, it is a change that takes place through practice or experience. Third, the change must be relatively permanent, that is, it must last a fairly long time. Broadly, theories of learning can be classified into classical conditioning, operant conditioning, observational learning and cognitive learning. In general, two types of psychologists, behavioral psychologists and cognitive psychologists, have studied learning, and they have gone about their research in a very different ways. Behavioral psychologists have focused on the learning of associations through classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning involves learning associations between events in our environment, such as the aroma of biryani being cooked signals that a delicious meal will follow. Operant conditioning focuses on learning associations between our behavior and its environmental consequences, such as that additional studying usually leads to better grades. In this module, we will focus on what behavioral psychologists have discovered about learning associations through classical conditioning. Pavlov and his amazing salivating dogs. At the beginning of the 20th century, something happened in the lab of Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov that brought him the Nobel Prize. Pavlov's subjects drooled at him. Actually, Pavlov was studying digestion. To observe salivation, he placed meat powder on a dog's tongue and measured the resulting flow of saliva. However, after repeating this procedure many times, Pavlov noticed that his dogs were salivating before the food reached their mouths. In this picture, you can see the apparatus which was originally used by Pavlov to study the role of salivation in digestion and later in his studies of classical conditioning. So, in this picture, the dog is tied with a harness and there is a tube which is attached to its mouth for collection of saliva. Then the tube is in turn attached to a device in order to count the drops of saliva. This tube is again in turn connected to a revolving drum for recording responses. You can see on the table there is a bowl which contains meat powder, and lastly there is an observation screen through which on the other side Ivan Pavlov would observe the entire procedure. Later, the dogs even began to salivate when they saw Pavlov enter the room. Pavlov believed that salivation is an automatic inherited reflex. His dogs were supposed to salivate when he put food in their mouths, but they were not supposed to salivate when they merely saw him. This was a change in behavior due to experience. Pavlov realized that some type of learning had occurred and soon began investigating it. He called it conditioning. Because of its place in history, this form of learning is now called classical conditioning or learning by association. Pavlov's experiment. How Pavlov studied conditioning. To begin with, he rang a bell. At first, the bell was a neutral stimulus, that is, the dogs did not respond to it by salivating. Immediately after, he placed meat powder on the dogs' tongues, which caused reflex salivation. This sequence was repeated a number of times: bell, meat powder, salivation, bell, meat powder, salivation, and so on. Eventually, as conditioning took place, the dogs began to salivate when they heard the bell. By association, the bell, which before had no effect, began to evoke the same response that food did. This was shown by sometimes ringing the bell alone. Then the dogs salivated even though no food had been placed in their mouths. Psychologists used several terms to describe these events. The meat powder is an unconditioned stimulus, that is, a stimulus innately capable of producing a response, salivation in this case. Notice that the dog did not have to learn to respond to unconditioned stimulus. Such stimuli naturally trigger reflexes or emotional reactions. Because a reflex is innate or built in, it is called an unconditioned or non-learned response. Reflex salivation was the unconditioned response in Pavlov's experiment. The bell starts out as a neutral stimulus. In time, the bell becomes a conditioned stimulus, a stimulus that because of learning will elicit a response. When Pavlov's bell also produced salivation, the dog was making a new response. Thus, salivation had also become a conditioned or learned response. So, a quick interim summary about the elements of classical conditioning. First, we had unconditioned stimulus, and the symbol is US, and which means that a stimulus which is innately capable of eliciting a response. Example, the meat powder. Then second element is unconditioned response. The symbol is UR, and it means an innate reflex response elicited by an unconditioned stimulus. Example is reflex salivation to the unconditioned stimulus. Third, neutral stimulus. Symbol is NS and it means that a stimulus that does not evoke the conditioned response. Example can be the bell before conditioning. Then the fourth element is conditioned stimulus. The symbol is CS and which means that the stimulus which evokes a response because it has been repeatedly paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Example can be bell after conditioning. And lastly, the conditioned response. The symbol is CR, which means a learnt response elicited by a conditioned stimulus. Example is salivation to the conditioned stimulus. Classical conditioning is also known as respondent conditioning, as the learnt response is elicited involuntarily from the subject. It is also known as Pavlovian conditioning, named after Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, the first person to investigate classical conditioning extensively. General learning processes in classical conditioning. We have seen how classical conditioning works. A new learned response, the conditioned response, is elicited by the conditioned stimulus in preparation for the arrival of the unconditioned stimulus. This response learning is also referred to as acquisition, that is, the period in conditioning during which response is reinforced. But what happens after acquisition? To know more, we now turn to a discussion of the other general learning processes that follow acquisition in classical conditioning. 1. Extinction and spontaneous recovery. From Pavlov's experiment, let us assume a scenario where the presentation of meat powder is completely stopped. Will the dog keep on salivating forever just to the sound of bell? It results in extinction, that is, the weakening of a conditioned response through removal of reinforcement. So, the dog would eventually stop salivating to the bell, as the bell no longer signals that the meat powder is coming. Suppose the conditioned response of one of the Pavlov's dogs was extinguished and the dog was kept out of the experimental setting for several days, and if the dog was then placed again in the experimental setting, it would salivate at the sound of the bell. Evidence of salivation under these circumstances would indicate spontaneous recovery of the dog's conditioned response. That is, after extinction, the conditioned stimulus is presented alone, the conditioned response sometimes will reappear. This is called spontaneous recovery of the response. However, the strength of the conditioned response will not be great as it was originally, but partial recovery of the conditioned response will occur. Stimulus generalization and discrimination. Stimulus generalization refers to the tendency to respond to stimuli similar to but not identical to a conditioned stimulus. On the other hand, stimulus discrimination refers to the learned ability to respond differently to similar stimuli. From the following illustration, we can see that in the first instance, the dog has generalized a rope to a snake and was barking, whereas in the second instance, the dog was able to distinguish the rope from the snake and thus was not barking. This brings us to a question that whether emotional responses can be conditioned or not. One of the first attempts to study the development of emotional responses, such as becoming fearful, occurred in the 1920s. At this time, psychologists did not yet know if emotional responses could be conditioned. John Watson, an American psychologist who was also the founder of behavioral psychology, realized that he could use Pavlov's conditioning procedure to study the development of emotional behaviors in an objective way. Now, let us have a look at a study conducted by John Watson on an infant named Albert. To examine the possible role of such conditioning in human emotional responses such as fear, Watson and his research assistant Rosalie Rayner conducted a study on an infant named Albert. When the conditioning phase of the study began, Albert was 11 months old. Let us think about the little Albert study in terms of 4 elements of classical conditioning, that is, the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. As an unconditioned or neutral stimulus, the researchers used a white laboratory rat. Albert was not afraid of the rat. In fact, when he saw the rat before the conditioning, he moved toward it and touched it. What was the reflex that Watson and Rayner used? While Albert was looking at the white rat, Watson quietly sneaked behind him with an iron bar and a hammer and clanged them together. Albert's reflexive response, the unconditioned response, was the fear avoidance response. That is, he cried and he tried to crawl away to this unexpected loud noise, that is the unconditioned stimulus. Watson and Rayner paired the sight of the white rat, the neutral stimulus that became the conditioned stimulus, with the unexpected loud noise, the unconditioned stimulus, several times until the sight of the white rat started eliciting the fear avoidance response, that is crying and trying to crawl away from the rat. It took them only 7 pairings. This study was unethical, of course, and psychologists would not be allowed to conduct such a study today. It is important to understand that classical conditioning is not only involved in conditioning negative emotional responses such as fear, but can also be used to develop positive emotional responses to stimuli. For example, classical conditioning is used in advertising to condition positive feelings and attitudes towards products. Think about advertisements that pair celebrities with products. Pairing popular professional players with products in advertisements is a good example. The advertisers attempt to use our positive feelings about these celebrities to condition positive responses to their products. The celebrity serves as the unconditioned stimulus and the product as the conditioned stimulus. We shall now examine the significance of classical conditioning to our daily life. Since some of our emotional responses to stimuli are learned, perhaps they can be unlearned. The extinction and alteration of disturbing emotional responses by classical conditioning is one form of behavior therapy, or as it is called, behavior modification. Systematic desensitization, one of the techniques employed in behavior therapy, is based on classical conditioning, and it was found to be extremely useful in treating phobias. Here a person imagines or visualizes fearful or anxiety evoking stimuli and then immediately uses deep relaxation to overcome the anxiety. Systematic desensitization is a form of counter conditioning because it replaces or counters fear and anxiety with relaxation. To sum up then, in today's lesson we have understood about the definition of learning, Pavlov's experiment and the procedure of classical conditioning, general learning processes in classical conditioning which included extinction, spontaneous recovery, stimulus generalization and discrimination, then the Little Albert study where we saw whether emotional responses can be conditioned, and lastly the significance of classical conditioning to daily life where we talked about systematic desensitization as one of the techniques employed in behavior modification.